Hello. So we're moving on in chapter 3 and looking at the beginning of chapter 4 for this week's work. So the scholarship in chapter 3 is a selection from a book called The Implied Spider by Wendy Doniger. So Wendy Doniger is a Hindu scholar. So she studies Eastern religion and also Eastern language. And Hindu and Sanskrit are Indo-European languages. They're connected to the European languages going back to the Indo-European original group, which of course we don't have anything by. So the title, The Implied Spider, points to that, right? If you see a web, there is a spider that spun that web, even if you don't see the spider. If the spider, say, has died or something, the web is there. It had to have been created by a spider. Likewise, the Indo-Europeans no longer exist, but their language can be, in fact, deduced from the fact that you have these other languages that share similarities, and following the rules of pronunciation and grammar and so forth, you can actually work your way back to an approximation of that original language. So that's what the implied spider in the title refers to. Doniger is contrasted to Malinowski. Malinowski felt that the only way you could understand a myth was within the cultural context it came from. It would not make sense outside of that context. Doniger is more of the idea that you can, in fact, do comparative mythology and that you can actually sort of compare and contrast. Now, she's not being as loose with evidence as, someone like Fraser was, which is, what Malinowski was reacting to. And her overall point is all story seems to come from some common source. And her argument is that myth probably comes from some original sense of loss, such as an infant would feel when it gets weaned from its mother. So that idea of separation, and then there's a need for that connection, and story sort of fills that. So that's sort of what she's looking at, that there are common experiences, death, birth, and even things like getting into relationships with people. All of those are common. Every culture has those. There's not a culture that doesn't have that. So she's got a point. Her point is contrasted with that of Malinowski. So the comparative story is the story of Noah and the flood. And that's not the only flood narrative that exists. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which comes from Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh has a flood narrative as well. The narrative is not told in the story. What we see is the survivor, Utnapishtim, who features prominently in the second part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And you know about the flood story because he's the survivor of the flood, like Noah was. The Greeks also have a flood story where the survivors are Deucalion, who is the son of Prometheus, and Pyrrha, who is the daughter of Pandora and Epimetheus. So they're the ones who survive the flood and repopulate the earth. Now, some people say there has to have been a real flood that spawns these. I would say that is not necessarily the case. There was a common view that water was the basis for everything. I mean, different philosophers argued that there was a certain element that was more primal than others. Some argued fire, some argued water, some argued air. But if you believe that it's water, then water undergirds everything, and you could see how someone might think that at some point there might be a disaster where the water that's under everything would just come up to the surface and would flood everything. I don't want to assume that there was an actual flood. Now, what there would have been every year in the Nile area and also in Mesopotamia is you would have had those great rivers, the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. They would flood every spring. And people would die when they flood, but you'd also have, of course, great growth because it would fertilize fertilize and help things grow in the area around the river. So it's life and death sort of combined. It's a powerful image, and again, people might very well have thought, hey, this flood happens every year. What happened if it really got really big? I think that's more likely than that there was an actual flood. So, but you're going to get some comparison and contrast here between the Jewish account in Genesis with the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, which is briefly described in the chapter. The Nachleben section of chapter 3 involves the story of Leda and the Swan. So Leda and the Swan goes as follows. Leda is a queen. She is the wife of Tyndareus, who is the king of Sparta. Zeus sees her, Zeus wants her, and Zeus, to seduce her or to basically get in her pants or the equivalent of her pants, disguises himself as a swan, gets close to her, and then while she's cuddling the swan, he then becomes Zeus, and they mate. Now, that story in the ancient world, and the kids that are the result of that are Castor and Pollux, and Clytemnestra and Helen. So two of the kids, Pollux and Helen, are the children of Zeus and Leda, and Castor and Clytemnestra are the children of Tyndareus and Leda. And they were born in eggs. So there were two eggs, one mortal, one immortal, and they came out of the eggs. That story leads to the Trojan War because, of course, Helen is the cause for the Trojan War. So there's this sense behind the action of Leda's mating with Zeus that disaster is going to come from it. Now, is the how do we imagine that mating? Was it consensual or was it not? So the two versions we have of modern poets, William Butler Yeats, who came back to the story of Leda and the Swan several times. Yeats presents the mating as not consensual, basically as a rape. And there are some pictures in your book that show the swan attacking Leda, which again suggests not consensual. H.D. Hilda Doolittle, who went under the poetic name of H.D., she, in her version, the story is different. It's more of a seduction. Leda is a willing participant in the event. Now, Zeus is a powerful figure, so to some extent it still smacks of someone in power using their power to get what they want at the expense of someone who doesn't. There's still maybe that. But in Hilda Doolittle's version, it's presented in a much more romantic way. So, different ways of taking that story, and that when we see both of them. Now, chapter 4 is ostensibly about two figures, Hades and Demeter. Hades is the god of the underworld, and Demeter is the goddess of grain and agriculture. Now, a brief word about the underworld and the afterlife. The Greeks had no common view of the afterlife. There were Greeks who did not believe in an afterlife, believed that when you died, that was it. Some of them were atheists, but some were not. So in other words, there were some who were theists who still believed that when you died, that was it. There was nothing after. The only thing that you could count on would be if you had done something great so people would remember you, or you had been a great author and your works lived on, but there was no guarantee of any sort of afterlife. The common view of the afterlife is that people are in the underground. They're in the underworld, which is underground, because of course you bury the body there, and that the souls are stuck there. Cerberus won't let them go, and there's a place of punishment. There's a place that's fairly pleasant, even though it's sort of gloomy because it's still underground. So you've got that view is the common view we think of, but that isn't the only view. There were some who believed in reincarnation, and Homer in the Odyssey presents an underworld similar to it's underground and it's gloomy. But in his version, there really isn't. There's a place of punishment for the absolute worst figures. But most people end up in a common area that's just gloomy because they're dead, right? I mean, life is great, and if you're not alive, then it sucks, period. That's, nothing more than that. So there are lots of ways to look at the underworld. The geography of the underworld, where you've got the different rivers, that all comes later. So over time, they developed and fleshed that out. But originally, I think there was just a sense that maybe something survived, like a spirit or soul survived, and that the reason that you honor the dead and the reason that you have festivals, near graveyards, like on certain days of the year, the reason that you do that is to keep the dead happy, so that they will not, in fact, be angry ghosts. So some of that's going on. But there's nothing 100% clear. So there's no, everyone believed it. No, there's none of that. So we don't have stories about Hades, really. We do have stories in which the underworld features, and we'll see one in chapter 12, which deals with Odysseus. But only that one. Okay. The literary work that's in chapter 4, the Greek work, is Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter. So a word about Homeric hymns. First of all, Homer did not compose the Homeric hymns. At some point, it was felt that these works were worthy of Homer, and so the 31 Homeric hymns were given the title Homeric Hymn. And the ancients, when they refer to the hymns, as they do, they sometimes quote from Homeric Hymn number 2, Homeric Hymn number 4, Homeric Hymn number 3, and number 5. Those are the ones that are quoted from most often. When they're quoted from, the author who quotes them actually says, as Homer said, Homer did not compose these. The Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter is around the same time as Homer, probably around 700, maybe a little before 700 BCE. But it was almost certainly composed by an Athenian author, because it deals with the Eleusinian mysteries. Eleusis was a suburb, roughly. I mean, it was a separate city, but it was very close. It was 14 miles from Athens, and it was under Athenian control. Eleusis, there was a festival held every year, and people would go. They'd be initiated in the mysteries of Demeter, the Eleusinian mysteries. And that supposedly gave them the chance of a happy afterlife. That seems to be a big part of the appeal. Homeric Hymn number 2 tells the story of how Hades kidnapped Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter, and ultimately he has to release her, but because she ate some pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she has to spend some part of the year. And different authors make it 3 months, some make it 4 months, some make it 6 months. She has to spend a certain period of time in the underworld with her husband. The rest of the time she spends above ground with her mother. The story, in part, serves as proto-science, right? You've got the changing of the seasons. You've got a period where things are growing, and then you've got a period where things are dying or appear to be dead, right? So spring and winter. That seems to be like one of the things behind the story. The story as presented in Homeric Hymn number 2 was probably sung at the festival every year. That was probably part of the festival. And it looks like the people would enact parts of that story as they travel from Athens to Eleusis. So that seems to be part also of the ritual, that they're enacting things that are told in this story. But the author probably is from the Attica, from the area around Athens, rather than from the Greek islands where Homer likely was from. So it's not by Homer. It's probably, I think you could judge it as being as good as Homer or very close to Homer. It uses Homeric style language, as does Hesiod. I hope you like it. It's a fairly straightforward account or story. If you, for some reason, still don't have your book, or you don't have access to your book, again, if you look in the modules, you'll see that I have the version of Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter from Perseus with notes, where I've added notes. So, all right, that covers sort of the main points that I wanted to make sure that I hit. If you've got questions, you can certainly come to the meetings on Thursday, right? The office hour on Thursday. So on Zoom, and that you can find in the announcements. You can find the link to that. All right. Well, I'm going to end it now. So I hope you enjoy this stuff. I think there's sort of a fair amount of fun stuff this time, and so I think you'll find it easier and more enjoyable maybe than some of the stuff that we've seen so far.